This Elbaf is not what it seems. This sun god is no warrior of liberation, and this mirror is not a good idea to put in the women's quarters Sanji. And then Gear 5th casually strolls its way into this chapter. And did you catch what happened with it? Because I didn't. I completely missed it the first time. And we'll get into that, but first, I really liked the opening of this chapter because the crew were acting exactly like the fans did at the end of the last chapter. They're so confused about their current situation that they're offering their own theories. My favorite is that Nami suggests that they were all gigantified, which, actually not an outrageous idea, considering she's now seen Luffy become a giant twice on Wano and on Egghead Island, so there are powers out there that can feasibly result in gigantification. However, thanks to Sanji, we've now confirmed that Robin is nowhere in the immediate vicinity. In the last video, I was making a big deal about Chopper using his nose to potentially find everyone, but as it turns out, Sanji's nose is much more better, at least for women, which is a legitimately useful utility in the pervert's toolkit. Like how Sanji was able to use his woman radar to find and protect Bonnie on Egghead Island. I think Oda's realizing that it's very difficult to chide Sanji for his ways when they have very beneficial side effects. But this is what I would describe as an unusually creepy chapter of the One Piece, because this series, it goes dark at times, but it doesn't generally bridge into this sort of territory. The whole idea of this model world is it's quite sinister, because if I'm understanding this correctly, and I may not be, everything on Elbaf right now, if we're even on Elbaf right now, is unreliable chaos. But if I am understanding this situation, then what we have is at least one giant who has been capturing humans to put in his diorama society, and may very well have been doing this for generations. The people we're seeing in this world could have been born in the model. Remember that the lifespans of giants are somewhere between 300 to 400 years. So this could be quite a long-running experiment where we've seen multiple generations of people, and it creeps me the crap out. Another morbid thought I had is that Sanji essentially cooked and ate some giant's pet rabbit, because that was clearly no ear god, but well. And something I also wonder is if these humans believe they're giants. Like, do they believe that they were born on Elbaf and that they're really big people? It's all very ethically questionable, to say the least. Very Truman Show with Lego. And you've got to wonder what all these other humans, I guess they are gonna do after learning that their entire existence is a lie. Although I think there could be quite the brilliant reason why Eiichiro Oda has elected to begin this arc in such a weird way. And I'm wondering if the model world might be a manageable way of introducing us to Elbaf without instantly being overwhelmed by its scale. As if what we're seeing right now is the experience of Elbaf that a giant would receive, and then when we do get into the actual island, we're going to see all of the same architecture, just one, obviously not made of Lego, and two, unfathomably bigger. It's like looking at a map of a country. It boils this massive entity down to a much more manageable mental image. And the idea reminds me a lot of Tiny Huge Island in Super Mario 64, which was a level where you could visit a miniature version of it or a gigantic version of it. And right now, we could be in the miniature Elbaf. Our sun god must have taken inspiration from something to build this model society, and it would be really cool if we eventually visited the landmarks like Big Stein's castle, but this time everything was to giant scale. But look, non-consensual human experiments aside, this arc so far, really fun. This chapter was especially enjoyable because it gave us a lot of those classic Straw Hat crew interactions. We have Sanji getting annoyed at Zoro for enabling Luffy. We have Nami knowing exactly what Luffy's reaction to the warning would be. We also have Nami extorting Chopper, and Sanji being a pervert wanting to install some of the glass in the women's quarters of the Sunny. All the stuff that we don't have time for once the story of an arc really kicks into gear and Oda begins focusing more on lore drops and large-scale plot points that need to be dealt with immediately as chaos rapidly builds and spirals out of control into a grand explosive ending. This is not that. This is the comparatively calm breathing time that we get once every few years. And it really makes me want a One Piece spin-off focused on the mundane in-between moments of the Straw Hat crew. Like what happens on the Thousand Sunny during the travel time between islands. Because these interactions are, or at least they were, the lifeblood of One Piece. Seeing the chemistry of our crew and getting back to Luffy's core mission, which is to just have a fun adventure. So I'm very grateful that we're getting as much of that as possible in these chapters. Although my favorite Straw Hat interaction in this chapter was definitely the one between Luffy and Usopp, where Luffy says, "Bruh, you should have been able to defeat the big cat. Remember, Usopp, this is post-time skip. We can do that sort of thing now." Which at first glance is a fun joke at Usopp's expense as always, but it actually highlights something much deeper, which is the faith that Luffy has in Usopp. At this stage, Luffy probably understands Usopp's true abilities better than Usopp himself does, because Luffy doesn't have that layer of fear clouding his assessment. I don't think I have anyone who believes in me as much as Luffy believes in Usopp. In fact, I doubt many of you do, because Luffy's belief borders on zealotry. He has equal faith in each and every crew member. He's not the One Piece fanbase. He doesn't see Usopp as below Zoro, Sanji, and the rest. Luffy knows what Usopp is capable of, and in this case, he's just a little surprised that he didn't see it in action. So this could be wishful thinking, but this could be the start of Usopp's own personal arc, because we're here now. We are on Elbaf, maybe. Again, still not confirmed at this stage, but we're starting to reach a point of now or never for Usopp. Rather unfortunately, he's very much the first in line to make his dream of becoming a brave warrior of the sea a reality. And we're now in a story arc based on the giants who have inspired him to come as far as he has. And I do think that he's going to need to prove himself on this island in some way or another, because when you've got the captain going, mate, you got to start packing up these cats, then you're gonna feel the pressure to pack some cats. But while we wait for Usopp to summon his courage, let's talk about our imposter sun god. The first thing to say is that he or she, actually no, that's the first thing to say, I think that this sun god might be a she, because when we see maybe her walking down the hallway, there's a close-up of the sun god wearing high heels, which Oda does traditionally reserve for women unless you are Dellinger or Doflamingo. And if that's the case, it makes the situation fairly immediately less scary to me. Because when it comes to introducing women as antagonists in an arc early on, Oda has a very standard formula, which is the femme fatale that transforms into an ally, like Viola on Dressrosa, Pudding on Whole Cake Island, Hiyori on Wano, Stussy on Egghead, etc. Beautiful women don't often stay enemies for long, and in fact, they usually turn out to be the victims that we go on to help. So I can definitely see the sun god removing that horrid deer mask to reveal a drop-dead gorgeous giant woman, and that would be the classic Oda subversion, sort of like what he did with Yamato, setting up this lurking, fearsome, potentially antagonistic presence just to subvert it with beauty. And it feels like what we're waiting for is for this to be a moment of big misunderstanding. We've set up this terrifying and kind of sickening scenario, and then it could all turn out to be something much more innocent that the Straw Hat stumbled into and ruined after getting smashed on Absinthe. However, I don't know if this is just Oda messing with perspective and scale for the sake of fun art, but the sun god looks massive even for a giant. Like, this giant makes giants look not giant. Most Elbaf giants we've met are somewhere between 17 to 22 meters tall, so they make humans look small, but nowhere near as small as the sun god is currently making the crew look. In fact, right now the sun god seems more similar to the height of Oars, who is just under 70 meters tall. And so there's some very cool potential that what we're actually seeing here is another ancient giant, or a descendant of an ancient giant. And instead of ending up in the friendly part of Warland, we've gotten so drunk that we've stumbled into this very antagonistic territory of the ancient giants. I definitely hold off on that though, because it could just be Oda messing with scale. It's usually not a good idea to judge the size of anything from just a few panels, which is going to be a very consistent issue throughout the entire arc as we make our way through the very trippy giant society. Although, to Oda's credit, he has been remarkably consistent with scale so far. Like in the last chapter, when the bees looked a similar size to Nami compared to the people that we thought were giants. Turns out they looked similar because those people, not giants. Makes sense. And a lot of you thought that I was absolutely crazy for bringing up the bees, but as it turns out, you're only half right. Because I did, admittedly, say a lot of crazy things about chapter 1127, but it's one of those situations where we were right to be paranoid, but wrong in what exactly to be paranoid about. It's like when you believe so deeply in a conspiracy theory that turns out to be false, but only because there was an even crazier conspiracy theory happening in its place. Having brought that up though, I do think there's a discussion to be had about all of the errors in the last chapter, because it is looking like they were just production issues, and that's very unfortunate because it means that the last chapter was just plain sloppy, and there's not a huge amount of good excuses as to why. Like I said, as we painstakingly pointed them all out, there was an error on almost every single page, and there's still inconsistencies in this chapter as a result. For example, Nami now has her sword back after it mysteriously vanished halfway through the last chapter. So this is one of those situations where I'm really looking forward to the volume release, which is something that I almost never say, but it's because the volume versions are considered to be the final versions of these chapters. What we see every week in Weekly Shonen Jump is a glorified draft, because these chapters then get taken and polished further to be published in the volumes, which is also where they fix up any errors that have slipped bi-weekly. A great example of this is the notorious statement by Jinbei that Katakuri's Devil Fruit was a Logia during Whole Cake Island. This was published in Weekly Shonen Jump as a Logia. but in the volume release, the dialogue was changed to special paramecia. And it's the core reason why, to this very day, people still believe that Katakuri was a Logia user, because in defense of those people, that's what it said in the manga at one point. Here's the thing though, weird things are still happening here. Humans stuck in a model Elbaf doesn't explain everything. And what it especially does not explain is the shape-shifting cat that can transform into a lion. So there are still some odd things happening here that are gonna need some explaining. But going back to the sun god briefly, the use of the deer skull is quite a striking element. Not just because it's all creepy and such, but because it immediately brought my mind to the Holy Knights. Specifically that member wearing a very similar skull who we met behind a very young Figurland Garling in Kuma's part of the God Valley flashback. I do think it would be a pretty meh to try and draw a connection between those two because of that alone, but I do find it curious that Oda would use such a strong design choice for two characters in such quick succession. You don't just give people stag skulls as a common piece of headwear, and so I'm really looking forward to learning more about this sun god, if that is indeed your real name, as well as that one Holy Knight who doesn't even have a name, provided he even survived the God Valley incident. And that brings us to Gear 5th. Something very, very special happened with Gear 5th in this chapter. And I really enjoyed Luffy's use of Gear 5th because it might seem like overkill for everyone who becomes overly concerned with all of the powering and the scaling. I've seen a few comments confused as to why Luffy's using his ultimate form against what is probably a very basic Elbaf snake, but he's using it because it's thematic. During this chapter, Luffy and the crew realize that they were trapped in someone else's fabricated world, and any sense of feeling trapped is unacceptable to the warrior of liberation. So this is Luffy's way of taking that freedom back, asserting that no one controls his freedom but him. And there's also that very curious thing that you may or may not have noticed, but Luffy's clothing doesn't change when he enters Gear 5th. This is extremely noteworthy because on Egghead Island, when Luffy activated this form, Oda abandoned the Egghead outfit entirely. Luffy just switched to his more basic Gear 5th attire. Whereas now on what is maybe Elbaf, or at least a model of Elbaf, Luffy seems to have embraced his Viking attire, and it does change, it changes color, but Luffy elects to keep the outfit on. He seems to feel free in his Viking garb in a way that he didn't in the future outfit of Egghead. I'm really glad he's keeping it though, because Gear 5th is one of those ideas that can risk getting stale if you don't keep introducing new elements to it, and now I'm really excited for every new outfit change because it presents the possibility of a brand new looking Gear 5th form, with my favorite aspect of this one being that Luffy's Viking helmet disappeared and he's using his hair to make the horns instead. I didn't even notice that at first, it took my artist to point that out. Although the other thing about this is the actual sun god, not the giant in this chapter, the proper one that the giants of Elbaf worship. My guess would be that the actual sun god wore something very similar to how Luffy is dressed right now. Given that he was a deity of Elbaf, being garbed in Elbafian wear makes sense. So I'm expecting a giant to see Luffy using Gear 5th at some point and be blown away that Luffy looks almost exactly the same as some sort of ancient sun god statue or painting or other depiction. And if I was the fake sun god, the skull sun god in this situation, I would be overjoyed because I would have stumbled upon a super rare model to use in whatever's going on here, maybe some sort of Elbaf warhammer. I mean, the room outside the box did look disturbingly like a hobby den. And in the end, I can't fault Luffy's logic of running all the way to the other side to hopefully find another mirror to break, and who knows what we'll find beyond that. Perhaps this is all some elaborate exhibit in a giant museum, and what we found in this chapter was the maintenance room behind it. I don't know, almost literally anything is possible, and you let me know what you think in the comments below.